Hi, my name is Melanie Finch and I'm from the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment at Monash University. Today I want to tell you a bit about some work that I've done on water loss and the origin of thick ultramylonites, and I also want to talk a little bit about where I'm taking this work next towards the end of the presentation. If you want to read the paper that I wrote on this work, you can find it on my website, which is down here, melaniefinch.net. You can also email me if you have any questions, and you can check me out on Twitter. I post lots of pictures of really nice rocks and thin sections, so that's pretty fun. All right, so the work I'm telling you about today is based on some naturally deformed rocks, and they come from this part of northwest Argentina in an area called Sierra de Quilmes. So this region is part of a back arc that was deformed during the Framantinian orogeny. And yeah, that's all you really need to know. So that's when these ultramylonites and mylonites formed in this region. So this is zooming in. We have this Sierra de Quilmes here, and then zooming in on this area in here. So we've got quite a complex structure here, and the evolution of this complex was reported in Pablo Farias's paper in 2020, so that's where this map is from. But I'm focused really on this area up here where we have quite an amazing shear zone. So it's called the El Pichar shear zone, and what we have is a gradation from undeformed or protomylonitic rocks, so undeformed rocks first, and then protomylonitic rocks, then mylonitic rocks, and then finally an ultramylonitic band of rocks as well. So if we have a look at the scale here, it's about 500 meters here. So this ultramylonitic band is about 1 kilometer thick. So you probably already know that's quite unusual. So ultramylonitic rocks usually form thin bands within rocks that have been at lower strain, and 1 kilometer thick ultramylonite is quite strange, and it suggests that thickening processes or shear zone widening processes have occurred. This is what one of the rocks looks like. These are amazing rocks. They're really quite spectacular. The structures are quite wonderful. So we have these big class of K feldspar and plagioclase that show really nice shear structures, delta class, sigma class, things like that, and in amongst this recrystallized matrix. So if we have a look in more detail at the transition between these rocks, so in the least deformed rocks, we have sort of the protolith, which is a granitic diatexite. You can see garnet in there and cordierite. And then with higher strain, we go through this sequence here. So first we form an orthogneiss, we still retain some features of the protolith there, so there's garnet in these rocks as well. And this grades into a protomylonite, which has a really high proportion of porphyroclasts. Then a mylonite, which has a lower proportion of porphyroclasts and a higher proportion of recrystallized matrix. And then finally into this ultramylonite, which has really rounded sort of these naked class of K feldspar and plagioclase in amongst a very recrystallized matrix. This is a photo from a textbook, this one, not from the field area, but it's just to sort of make the point about the difference between protomylonites, mylonites, and ultramylonites. So protomylonites, by definition, have 10 to 50% recrystallized matrix. Mylonites have 50 to 90% recrystallized matrix, and ultramylonites have more than 90% recrystallized matrix, so not many porphyroclasts in those. So it's really easy to form an ultramylonite in a rock that already has a fine or small sort of grain size. But when you start off with something like this, like a granite or a granitic diatexite, it's actually quite difficult to end up with something like this. You need high strain over a long period of time. And even when you have that, normally these layers of ultramylinite are quite thin. So we know that when we see thick layers of ultramylinite, there needs to have been some widening within that layer of ultramylinite, so shear zone widening. So this can occur due to hardening of the shear zone or weakening of the host rock that surrounds the shear zone. So hardening of a shear zone can occur due to the accumulation of dislocations, a change in deformation style, or due to dehydration. So water weakens rocks and minerals, and so if water leaves the shear zone, or is expelled from the shear zone, then that can cause shear zone hardening. Host rock weakening is another process that can cause shear zones to widen. Basically, if the host rock becomes weaker than the shear zone, then strain will migrate out into the host rock. And that can occur due to reaction softening, shear heating, or water influx. So again, water weakens rocks and minerals. So if water gets into the host rock, it can make it weaker than the shear zone. So that's all that's sort of required for shear zone widening. So because water plays such an important role in the strength of minerals and rocks, we decided to have a look at whether this was responsible for widening the ultramylinetic band in the pitch-R shear zone. So water in deforming rocks can take the form of H2O and also OH species, but we just refer to all of these as water, so lumping them all in together. So when water is between crystals, so on grain boundaries, it decreases the rock strength and promotes grain boundary sliding and other processes like that. But when it's within crystals, water decreases the strength of silica oxygen bonds. And this is a process known as hydrolytic weakening. So a lot of different papers have looked at the role of hydrolytic weakening in shear zones, and they've done that by measuring the water content of minerals within sheared rocks, just to see whether the most deformed rocks have higher water content. You can do that using Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, and that basically tells you the water content within the crystals. And all these studies have been pretty careful not to measure or analyze the water content in grain boundaries, so you can sort of mask the grain so that you're only measuring the internal crystal water, the intracrystalline water. And so what these studies have found is that ultramylonites generally contain the most water and protomylonites contain the least water, and mylonites are in between. So this is what hydrolytic weakening looks like. So these studies have concluded that water infiltrated these rocks here and made them weaker. So that's where strain localized, forming the ultramylinetic band. Whereas where there was the least amount of water, there was the least amount of deformation and only protomylonites formed. So that seems pretty straightforward, but there's actually this other set of studies that have investigated what happens to intracrystalline fluids when you recrystallize minerals. And those studies have found that when you recrystallize quartz, fluids are liberated. So Falerios et al. 2010 found that quartz recrystallized by subgrain rotation contain fewer fluid inclusions than the protolith. And there was even less in rocks recrystallized by grain boundary migration. So recrystallization causes the liberation of water from grains, and then this water might be extracted from the shear zone. So that actually is sort of quite a different prediction, ends up with quite a different prediction for the correlation between the amount of deformation and the water content of rocks. So in the case of where recrystallization has occurred, and in the case of these studies that have looked at that, the rocks that are the most deformed and recrystallized should have the least amount of water. But this is actually opposite to what studies of hydrolytic weakening find. they find that water content should be the highest in the most deformed rocks. So we decided to take a look at this in our shear zone and look at the differences in water content between ultramylonites and less deformed rocks. So analysing the water content in these individual grains. So this is actually a protomylonite from the Pitchar shear zone, and this is more what an ultramylonite looks like here. So you can see that we have these quartz ribbons that wrap around the feldspar porphyra class, and that while we retain sort of this layering and then the stratification into different layers in the protomylonite, in the ultramylonite, we have a very mixed matrix. And well, this is just a beautiful example of a class in the ultramylonite, but generally it's more like this recrystallized matrix is much more of this mixed matrix in these rocks as well. So quite a different looking rock. When we have a look at the processes that have occurred in these rocks and compare those, we find that that while protomylonites and mylonites show dislocation creep, ultramylonites actually show diffusion creep and grain size sensitive processes. And this is reflected in the CPO data. So we see quite strong maxima in protomylonites and mylonites, but much more of a randomly distributed CPO in the ultramylonites. And, you know, this is taken as evidence of grain size sensitive creep in the ultramylonites. So they're sort of deforming in a different way. So this was just CPO data on quartz in that figure there. Okay, so to have a look at the differences in water content between these different rocks, we used Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, and we measured the water content in quartz and feldspar. And we compared ultramylonites to less deformed rocks. We measured 50 to 100 grains in 3 to 6 samples for each rock type. Yeah, so that took a while. Okay, so here are the results. So we have the water content here and the rock type down here. So weakly deformed, mylonitic, and ultramylonitic. Weakly deformed rocks are granitic diatexites as well as protomylonites. So because we found that generally protomylonites only contain a few more percent recrystallized matrix than granitic diatexites. So in these figures, we have the sample mean and standard deviation in black, and then in blue, the overall mean and standard deviation. Here I've got quartz, and here we've got feldspar. And what you see straight away is that the water content decreases from weakly deformed rocks through to ultramylonitic rocks in quartz and in feldspar as well. But, you know, it's all very well to sort of see this pattern in these graphs, but what we really care about is whether this is actually a statistically significant difference, because there's large variability here, right? Like these error bars are really big, and you could kind of argue that they're all within error of each other to an extent, but we can test to see whether this difference is statistically significant when these errors are also taken into account as well, or the variability is taken into account as well. So we did analysis of variance tests, which test whether the variability between the different samples is greater than the variability within the different samples. And then we did post hoc tests as well, which just tell us about the location of the difference, you know, after you do this omnibus test. Anyway, there's more detail about that in the paper that I'll tell you about at the end if you want to know more. We looked at, we found that water in quartz and feldspar, so was significantly lower in ultramylonites than in weakly deformed rocks. So this difference here was statistically significant. So that's interesting. We also found that this difference here was statistically significant. So ultramylonites also had significantly less water than mylonites. So cool. So while previous studies have found this situation, that the ultramylonites have the most water and the protomylonites have the least water, we have found actually the opposite. So ultramylonites have the least water, and it's significantly lower than weakly deformed rocks and than myelonitic rocks. So yes, that is a very interesting finding. Our results can be explained by these papers that have looked at the effect of recrystallization on the water content within minerals. So recrystallization liberates water, and so that the rocks that have undergone the most recrystallization should have the lowest amount of water. But then that begs the question that why did shear zones in these previous studies not lose their water during recrystallization like we think that ours did? So there are a few possible explanations. First of all, it may be that hydrolytic weakening occurred. So there might have been more water in some rocks, and this weakened the rocks and caused strain localization. But then the minerals did not undergo advanced and prolonged recrystallization, so they did not lose their original water content. So that is sort of one explanation for why they've retained that high water content. The second explanation could be, this syntectonic idea where water infiltration might have occurred during deformation instead of before deformation. So water diffused into the shear zone and preferentially infiltrated the most deformed rocks and grains, and that would result in the highest water content in the most deformed rocks. So that's another possibility for those previous studies to explain why their results are different to ours. The third possibility is that water might not have been extracted from the shear zone. So the water the water in their shear zones and in the minerals in their shear zones, these previous studies, might have been liberated from the grains during recrystallization, but may not have been extracted from the shear zone efficiently. So it might have just sat on grain boundaries and then eventually just diffused back into the grains. So those are three different ideas on what could have happened there. And so this last one, really leads us to think about what controls the fate of water in shear zones. So there has been, a lot of previous work on that, and it's shown that, so this paper by Magdalo in 2002 showed that the fate of water in shear zones is controlled by the pressure gradient between the shear zone and the surrounding rock. So Magdalo found that the pressure gradient depended on the angle between the shear zone and the shear direction. So shear zones that initiate parallel to the shear direction will not undergo extension or shortening during simple shear, so they'll remain at the same mean stress as the matrix. Conversely, shear zones that initiate or rotate into the field of instantaneous shortening during progressive general shear will thicken due to the stretching component perpendicular to the shear zone boundaries, which reduces the mean stress within the shear zone and attracts water from the surroundings. So that's what we have, illustrated over here. So it's only shear zones that rotate into the instantaneous extension direction and undergo stretching and thinning that will experience higher mean stress than the matrix, and that will lead to water expulsion from the shear zone and shear zone hardening. So that's a possible way where, the different shear zones can show sort of different relationships with the water content in their minerals. So then we're left with the question of what this means, or what all of this means for the generation of this 1 kilometre thick ultramyelonite that we see in northwest Argentina in Sierra de Quilmes. So we've come up with a model that's based in part on the what these papers down here have found. And I'll discuss a little bit more about the implications of some of these papers and these models at the end of this talk. So what we think, we start off with an undeformed rock, and so the granitic diatexite, and strain localizes somewhere within that granitic diatexite because of, for whatever reason. So it could be that area was more micaceous, or it had a pre-existing fault. So, something like that. So shearing generated heat within this zone and reduced the grain size, and strain localization occurred within that zone. Strain localization caused the recrystallization of grains within that zone and caused the liberation of water to grain boundaries, like we saw here. The liberation of water to grain boundaries actually facilitates diffusion creep, including grain boundary sliding and dissolution precipitation, which allows for fluid-assisted granular flow. So these processes cause phase mixing and decrease the connectivity of weak phases like biotite and muscovite. So that homogenizes the rock matrix and gives rise to this ultramylonite that we see here, and that mixed matrix that we see in that zone. So if we have high pressure in a thinning shear zone, then that means that water will be expelled to the shear zone boundaries. And that's according to that, that work of Mantelow in 2002 that I was just talking about before. So the water will be removed from the ultramylonite into the shear zone boundary. So it's just we'll take a little break from the model for a moment just to talk about a little aside on this process. So while the rate of water expulsion from the shear zone is roughly balanced with the rate of intracrystalline water liberation, then due to recrystallization, then a weak rheology will be maintained in the shear zone. But as the rate of intracrystalline water liberation slows due to continued water loss, so basically things dry up in here, then the ultramylonite will harden and the shear zone margins will become weaker than the ultramylonite. So then that will mean that the locus of deformation will move outwards. So that's what will happen here. So the ultramylonite will harden and this margin here will weaken. Okay, so if that happens, then the ultramylonite hardens, the margin weakens, and the locus of deformation moves outwards. So then we start to see shearing here, the generation of a protomylonite and then a myelonite, and then the whole process repeats again. So we get this repetition of the cycle and gradually gradually thicken the ultramylonite here as the locus of deformation just keeps moving outwards. Okay, so we reported this work in this paper here, so you can find that on my website there, or you can email me and I'll send you a copy. That was a little while ago now, 2016, but I'm talking about this work again because I'm sort of picking up a bit where I left off and applying it in new different ways. So all this, a lot of work, a lot of recent work has been looking at fluids in ductile shear zones. So previously, prior to this work by Fusais et al. In 2009, this work really sort of made us start thinking more about these sorts of processes, but there was work before this, like by Hobbs and others. So prior to this work, we've really considered that the high metamorphic grade in ductile shear zones means that it's really hard for water to move through those rocks. So we think of them as zones where everything's really compacted, and, water, sort of can't move freely through those rocks. It's really just restricted to moving on grain boundaries, which is a really slow process. But this work proposed a new way that water can move through rocks, and it's by this process of creep cavitation during grain boundary sliding. And Forsyth and al. sort of suggested that we can establish this dynamic granular fluid pump in ductile shear zones. So they had lots of beautiful figures in their paper. So these synchrotron images, which shows porosity in red, and these pore sheets throughout these naturally deformed mylonites from the Red Bank shear zone in Australia. And they showed, these SEM images that showed exactly what this porosity looks like on these grain boundaries, which is very cool. And they suggested that these pore sheets migrate by viscous grain boundary sliding, creep cavitation, and dissolution precipitation. In a process, this is one of their figures as well, in this sort of process like this. So you have, a pore space there, and we have grain boundary sliding here, and that, sort of shifts the fluid, or, shifts the pore space along, and then any fluids that within that pore space, would be shifted along with it. And then you kind of have this dynamic porosity moving through the rock due to that process of grain boundary sliding. So this is a really exciting new way of thinking about water migration through ductile shear zones. And a lot of people have been working on this theory and trying to find more evidence of this in rocks, but also, sort of doing experiments that try to understand more about this new way of water migrating through these ductile shear zones. So there's this paper that was published really recently, just a few weeks ago, that was looked at, was an experimental paper, and showed that these viscous shear zones generate these periodic pore sheets. So you can see that pore space through there, and we've got, minerals precipitating within that pore sheet as well. So we're really getting some pretty strong evidence now that this is actually, that we should be thinking about the way that fluids migrate through ductile shear zones differently. And this has huge implications for lots of things, but for mineral deposits as well. I think that there's this, I think that people think about ductile shear zones as, it's really hard to get fluids through them. But once we start understanding that it can be accomplished, and there are mechanisms for this syn deformational fluid flow, then we start to understand how situations like this might have occurred. So this is the Mary Kathleen ore deposit in Mount Isa in Australia. It's a uranium rare earth element deposit that was mined out a while ago. And right next to it, we have the Mary Kathleen shear zone, which is a ductile shear zone. It looks like this. There hasn't been too much work on this, but we are changing that now. We're starting work in this region now. And, the shear zone is right up next to the mine. And so people think that the shear zone played a part, in the migration of this fluid from depths and the cause of mineralization in this region. But we've never really understood how that fluid migrated through this zone, and we've never really understood how to kind of look at this shear zone to understand that mechanism. So, these new theories of how fluids move through ductile shear zones are representing sort of a new way of looking at these old mineral deposits and new ways of understanding mineralization in really economic regions like Mount Isa. So that's a cool direction of research that we're heading in now. And this is another intriguing paper that came out recently from some of my colleagues at Monash University, and they found that a connection, they found that basically trace elements can increase porosity during mineral replacement. So they found that when magnetite is replaced by hematite, cerium actually increases the porosity of hematite and enhances that replacement reaction. So this is really interesting and exciting because there are lots of ore deposits where we see these sorts of this sort of mineral placement reaction. And if we're also forming porosity during that process, then that's a really, we're starting to understand something about the way that fluids were moving through these rocks at the same time as metamorphism. So it's possible maybe pore sheet development can be affected by porosity generating metamorphic reactions in ductile shear zones as well. So that's something we're also exploring in this Mount Isa region and bringing together those different theories. So they're the avenues for our current and future research. So if you want to talk about this research, our research directions and this work more broadly, please feel free to email me. You can download this paper and my other papers from my website, and it'd be cool to, and I've got lots of photos of these rocks and other rocks on Twitter if you're into that. So this is another beautiful K-feldspar porphyra class from the Pitjantji zone, which is pretty amazing. Anyway, cool. Thanks very much for watching this talk. See you later.